fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. We're in the midst, actually drawing towards the end of a long conversation we've been having on architecture in the time of coronavirus. We have been doing this for almost 2.5 months now. And while we are entering into the 6th, 7th month of the epidemic here in the United States, the summer is also drawing on, and now that we are in August, I am going to start winding down this series on architecture and coronavirus. All this to say that if you have noticed, we have been releasing our podcasts weekly, and now onwards, as the academic year starts to gear up, we will be reverting to our normal schedule of a podcast every other week. To round out our discussion on architecture in the time of coronavirus, today I'm speaking to two people, and they both come from what might be considered to be, compared to most of the perspectives outlined in this podcast, from the more mainstreams of architecture practice here in the United States. Rachel Minnery is the director of Built Environment Policy at the AIA, the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C., and I'm talking to her about resilience and AIA and its thoughts on the virus and her own life in that context. And I'm talking to Patrick MacLeamy, who is the retired CEO of HOK, the famous firm with an extensive portfolio of practices, and he is giving his perspective on how a firm, a large firm, small firm, I guess, can deal with the challenges posed by a situation such as the virus with its enforced action on projects and on working from home. I hope you enjoy these conversations, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. All right, Rachel, thank you for being on Architecture Talk and having this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me.
You are the Senior Director of Resilience, Adaptation, and Disaster Assistance at the AIA. Couldn't you have added a few more big titles there? I mean, what is resilience, adaptation, and disaster assistance? Those are three huge, big portfolios, it seems to me. Rather than explain your job, can you tell me, just conceptually, what is the relationship between disasters, perhaps adaptation, but certainly what is the relationship between disaster and resilience? Shouldn't we be resilient outside of disasters? So why do those two things closely linked together?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm gonna give a little bit of background on the AI's work, and that is maybe one example of how people have gotten into what some refer to as the resilience movement. At AIA, or actually for a number of decades, architects have either within their own communities or their regions reached out and offered support to communities that are trying to recover and rebuild after disasters. And by, let's say, 2005, so we had the tsunami in Southeast Asia, we then had Hurricane Katrina, and then a number of tornadoes and floods, et cetera, in very short order.
And increasingly, this just seems to be the new normal.
That's right. Increasing in scope, severity, and as we're building up more and more our communities and increasing population, we just have more to lose.
And frequency, yeah.
And frequency, yep. And as architects, we have to kind of sit back and say, well, how do we get ourselves out of the disaster business and into more of the safety business, so that the buildings that we are designing are first located in less risky places, and then second of all are built to withstand the impacts of these shocks. And so that more or less has been the trajectory for us, is looking not just about how we continue to go through this cycle of getting hit and rebuilding and over again, and how do we get out of that and start focusing on how we can design our communities so that they can withstand these shocks.
So is that what resilience is? Being better able to withstand disasters?
It is in part. So this is where my job title isn't everything but the kitchen sink title, because they're in the resilience circles, there's criticism about proposing the idea of resilience, which in and of itself means to bounce back from. But for some communities, going back to what they have, it wasn't working in the first place. So we don't always want to bounce back. And in, for example, locations where they're having repeated flooding, again, it doesn't make sense to keep exposing ourselves to the same hazard over and over again. So that's where this notion of adaptation comes in, which is really about having foresight and thinking about the longer term and what really makes the most sense in terms of where you're choosing to design and build buildings.
Yeah, wouldn't that be a good idea to simply not run into disasters? And wouldn't that be the real ultimate resilient strategy?
Yes, exactly. The counter argument to resilience and investing in resilience is that in order to achieve a high payback, it means that you have higher exposure, higher risk exposure. And so, yes, ultimately, the idea is that you don't need to be resilient because you're not affected by any of these shocks or stresses.
You seem to distinguish in your writing between sustainability and resilience. What is the connection and what is the difference between those two concepts at a high level?
Yeah, at a high level, they're really under the same banner. I mean, generally speaking, it's about making choices today that take into consideration the needs of today, but also the needs of tomorrow. And yet at the same time, the sustainability movement has gained a lot of traction because they've had a great economic case to make for that. You know, if we save energy, we save water, we save money. And resilience, oftentimes investing in resilience, isn't really about saving money, or at least for first cost. It's about reducing your chance of having to spend it later. So it's
Right.
really more about risk avoidance than it is about being efficient.
So life cycle costing can some ways connect to the long-term investment strategies of resilience. Is that what it is?
Yes. Yes.
But it also seems to me that just from a non-specialist perspective, that resilience is a more life sympathetic concept for me than sustainability. I mean, it seems to me sustainability is about making things work perfectly, harmoniously, ecologically, well balanced, cyclically. Whereas it seems to me that life is inherently shot through with uncertainty and the inevitability of things that you're not expecting to happen happening. So building strategies that help us prepare for the unexpected is a more sustainable way of thinking about things, which is to say a resilient way of thinking than thinking about the perfect way to live with nature. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. You know, I think every movement that has built upon the initial sustainability movement that was really focused on environmentalism. But since then, sustainability has really expanded. You see all kinds of modifiers, social sustainability and social responsibility, that get at some of these more community equity factors and vulnerable populations.
Mhm.
And resilience, you know, I guess one of the things that I like about it is it realizes that when we only focus on the environment, for instance, we miss the boat, or we put blinders on to other issues, challenges, problems. Certain strategies might negatively impact others. So let's say, for instance, one of my classic examples is a sustainability strategy for stormwater infrastructure. And when you design, for example, bioswales to treat and slow down the absorption of rainwater, stormwater. And when you think about that in the off chance that we have an extreme flood or extreme rainfall, what is the capability of that nicely designed bioswale to be able to accommodate that surge of stormwater?
I mean, I think, one of the things about resilience and the question of preparing for disasters that intrigues me is that, of course, one can design for known disasters. I can design for a cloud burst. I can design possibly for a tornado. I can possibly design for a tsunami, or here in Seattle, a major earthquake. But part of the lessons we have learned from life is that disasters can take the form of things that we do not know, things that we cannot pre-expect. And how does one design for things we don't know? How do we build resilience into our cities and in our living systems to prepare for the unexpected or the unknown?
Yeah, I think maybe part of what you might be getting at with this is, sometimes we call it the double disaster, or the secondary hazards and cascading consequences. So every state and most larger cities or metropolitan areas has a hazard mitigation plan, and they've gone through a very scientific exercise to look at what the threats are in their region, and then
Right.
what the probability is of that hazard event occurring, what the impact might be, and then the frequency of which it would occur. So all of that amounts to kind of a risk characterization. And so all of these risks get ranked in terms of what the potential impact is. And I think the challenge is that we don't always know about where our interdependencies will succeed or where they will fail us. So in buildings, we can work with our structural engineers to design a very robust and stout building that can resist movement or impacts of winds, et cetera. But we can't necessarily guarantee that the electric company and the communications company will be able to service that building with power and internet. So these types of interdependencies are part of kind of what goes into the resilience equation. We have a saying that says a resilient building in a non-resilient community isn't resilient. So resilience really brings out this notion that you need to work in partnership, you need to work in collaboration with other sectors and other industries in order to arrive at kind of what we might call community expectations. What are the cost benefits of achieving a certain level of community performance, if you will.
What I'm hearing you say is that the real expectation of collaboration about interdependencies, what you call interdependencies, in one sense is desired, but in another sense, it must recognize that it is such a large world that the inevitability of weak links in the chain has to be prepared for. Is that
right?
What do you think?
So recently we published a business continuity planning guide for architects. And as part of the process of developing this guide, I learned a lot more about where there's a never-ending supply of risks out there. Let's just say that. And when you're assessing what your risk is to any given business or building, sometimes it means you really need to look pretty far out. We'll take the COVID crisis, for instance, and where we get our supply of medical equipment. And so at times, what we'll find is that when you really have an important piece of that supply chain is that you need to trace back to the risks in those areas of where those supplies or raw materials are sourced. So resilience is a never-ending research expedition when you really want to plan effectively.
Yeah, I think the point that I'm trying to get to is that the ambitions of resilience are so massive, so interdependent, so interconnected with so many uncertainties in the system that what does it mean to plan? I mean, the idea of plan, since I'm a card carrying modernist, so I will confess that up front. Plan seems to suggest that, you know what are the problems and therefore you can make a plan for it. But when you are dealing with a hope and expectation that is so gigantic and so dispersed across community, how do you plan?
There are a few rules of thumb. And I
Uh-huh.
think, we talk about community resilience. This might sound counterintuitive, but the answer to interdependencies is just to not have them. So the more that we can design and prepare ourselves to be self-sufficient during a downtime, the better we are to withstand a variety of hazards, even if we don't know what they're going to be.
Wow. So you're making an argument for reducing interdependencies? Everybody becoming self sufficient equals, let's just say, to push that, we should all become our own island?
No, I wouldn't go so far to that end of the spectrum, but I have another mantra that I use, and that is redundancy is resiliency. So as one mode breaks down or isn't working properly, you've got a backup plan. And it doesn't mean that you're going to live or to function up to your ideal standard, but can you get by?
Uh-huh. Right.
Can you cope during those periods?
So we build redundancy into our systems, and we try and build as much collaboration into our interdependencies. Yeah. I mean, when I think about those things, I think about, India, where I grew up. And I think about the kind of communities that sort of learned to survive by themselves, particularly in slums, because there was nobody watching out for them. There was really, even the city governance didn't really care about them. But because there was no externalities that they could, sue, they developed modalities of survival, which I would call extremely resilient. They lived a constant state of disaster, I would say. So I guess what is more resilient? I mean, as a community. I mean, are we here in Seattle? Do you think way more resilient than your average slum in Colombia or Southeast Asia?
I think you're asking a really powerful question. And that kind of takes us back to our ability to survive on the planet as human beings. And
Hmm.
the more sophisticated our cultures and our societies become, the more they specialize. And the more they specialize, the more they lose general skills. If something really devastating were to take place, how would we be able to come together and support each other? And I think part of the question that you're asking too is related to community values and what we value, and how that drives the decisions and even the policy by which we enable certain populations to survive better than others.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the current COVID situation that we find ourselves in. And I, for one, like I think most people around me in my community, certainly in my university and so on, have completely surrendered all my agency to the big institutions of state.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting, I don't mean to sound insensitive, but it's been interesting as an observer of the crisis and how it's being managed to see that as a nation, this is the first national disaster that I think has ever occurred in my lifetime or in most people's lifetimes. And we have never had such freedoms, if you will. Leaving your house is a isn't a freedom that many people are enjoying right now, taken away from us. And yet we have all rallied around, most of us, I should say, have rallied around the shared goal that preserving the health and safety, especially of our older and more vulnerable populations, is a priority. And when we sort of recognize it as that and see how much we are valuing our fellow human beings and Americans, then it starts to put everything else into perspective. And those sacrifices don't feel as harsh when we know that we're helping one another through that process. But at the same time, every state is also handling this very differently from, the more capitalist approach, where individual business owners are going to have to determine the protocol by which they reopen up their buildings and occupy them, to other places that are still and will probably continue to for some time recommend that people stay at home. But I think the lack of data that we have on this particular virus is, I think, one of those uncertainties that you speak of. It's one thing to plan for this notion that infectious disease and pandemics are a risk. And I did go back to the city of Seattle hazard mitigation plan to see where this ranked, and it was number 7 on the list of hazards for Seattle. But you never know what that's going to look like. You don't know what the virus is going to be, how it's transmitted. And so there are so many characteristics of what that entails that I would imagine, I'm not a public health expert, that could be very complicated to try to plan for.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fantastic test case of resilience. You said that an epidemic showed up as whatever number 7 on that hazards assessment list. So what could we have done, or what should we do, prepared thinking of the future in our disciplines: architecture, urban design and planning, landscape, real estate, construction, the built environment industries? What can we do?
I think there's certainly a couple of things. I think one, more broadly, there is a call to action for architects to think about the impacts of, I've been referring to anything outside of your garden variety disaster, meaning not our typical flood, hurricane, windstorm, tornado. And thinking outside the box about how these other hazards could potentially impact the built environment. Traditionally, I think most architects would say, infectious disease, that's a public health issue.
Right.
And I don't want to say every architect thinks that way, but it can be a very abstract problem to try to address without more information. And yet, here we find ourselves in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, where every single building in the country has been affected. Most of them are not occupied, or in some cases, our homes are overly occupied.
Right.
And that really is a call to action for us to really think about, well, what does it mean to live in a future environment where we are expecting, with climate change, more disease, more volatility, if you will, and with that volatility, I think we need to, we need to take certain measures that allow us to protect the health of occupants in a safer way. So we just went through a big movement where this idea of open offices and collaboration amongst different classrooms and schools are really important. So there's this big push to community and collaboration, which is fantastic. Yet when it comes to a situation like this where we need to social distance, most buildings are not set up for that.
Right.
So it really is, I think, in many respects, a call for more adaptability and flexibility within our buildings. There were healthcare folks on our call today. They would say yes. And because we have a really lean and mean capacity issue for beds in hospitals, how do we accommodate for surge? We need better strategies to be thinking about these unusual times and unusual days and how we plan for those alternatives.
Yeah, I like that flexibility and adaptability. I mean, those seem to be two fantastic principles by which I could run a couple of studios at the University of Washington to say, because this is going to happen, right? As we come out of the virus, everybody's going to run studios, conceptual or academic studios at least, on how to prepare and how should architecture have responded.
And I would add that the lessons that we learned from that are going to help us. As you said, this is a good testing ground or test case. Not if, but when we have the big one on the West Coast and we lose a certain percentage of our buildings, there may be a larger community effort to take a step back and say, okay, well, given the buildings that we do have that are still standing and are safe to reoccupy, how do we collectively as a community want to utilize those buildings and repurpose them for other uses? So I wouldn't be surprised if we do get to a point where we're starting to think about the adaptive uses of buildings after other kinds of disasters as well.
Though it seems to me those are fundamentally different kind of disasters. I mean, an earthquake or a tsunami that significantly physically destroys infrastructure provokes the response, well, we got to find a way to build it back and just do it better and make sure we are not as vulnerable next time, like you were saying earlier. Whereas a pandemic, it doesn't physically destroy nothing, it just renders it useless. It feels like a different category of disaster, does it not?
Yeah, where it isn't, the work that I do at the AIA, our disaster assistance program is rooted in the notion that we provide specialized training to architects, engineers, and building officials to evaluate the damage to buildings after a disaster to determine whether or not they're safe to reoccupy. In this case, yeah, you're exactly right. The buildings aren't damaged,
But they're not safe to occupy.
they're almost accomplices, really, in the transmission of the disease to a certain extent. And I think better understanding how the virus lives on certain surfaces will tell us a lot about what choices we might make in materials in the future in our buildings between, hard surfaces and carpeting, for example.
Mhm.
And also our ventilation systems, I think, are probably going to gain a lot more attention in terms of how we design those, and as well as humidity levels that seem to be a critical part of the equation.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic thinking because uh, uh, how do we prepare buildings to not become accomplices or minimize their accomplice quality?
Yeah.
Is one is to social distancing, set up partitions everywhere and make sure nobody talks to anybody, which suggests might as well work from home and use Zoom. but how to design buildings so that they are antibiotic or better probiotic would be a fascinating challenge.
Yeah, it would. The notion of regenerative design, how do these become health giving in the end?
Yes, how do they actually help uh, nurture health rather than become a participant in pathologies, production of, like you said, accomplices. And it seems the medical establishment decided in this pandemic that most of our buildings are health hazards.
I mean, every building has a hallway or a corridor or a stairwell and an elevator in it. And when you are trying to social distance 6 feet, well, that might mean you can get two people in an elevator.
Maybe.
But how do you pass someone in a stairwell or in a hallway?
So, is this a big discussion? Are there conversation cycles brewing in the across
Yes,
the AIA on the impact of COVID on architecture?
yes, yes, definitely. And there are, was it last week? It was the pact of the West Coast states, so Washington, Oregon, and California. And the governors came out and said that one of their, I'll call it prerequisites to reopening the economy was a redrawing of floor plans for schools and businesses. So there is a recognition that either through planning or through other operational or behavioral changes that we make in buildings, that we will need to reoccupy buildings safely until the virus is gone. Um, and that might mean reduced occupant load. It might mean additional partitions or PPE for all of the building occupants or some of them. And we are, the trouble is when you think about what architects do is they incorporate and apply the codes and standards and guidance that is given to them. And
Right.
in this case, we don't have that. There are no codes or standards that directly address this, and so many industry organizations are following what the CDC and NIH and others are publishing, and I think I would say trying to translate or extrapolate that to impacts within the built environment. I think there's a lot of theorizing of what will become of the future of building design after this is all over. And, some of the architects and experts that I've been speaking with have all sort of brought to light the issues that were already affecting certain, we'll call them market sectors of buildings before the COVID-19 crisis, such as more and more people going to Amazon or online retailers and the impacts that has had on brick and mortar stores and main streets of smaller towns. And so for offices as well, it sounds like some people are doing really well with this remote working. And so what does that mean for the demands that will be placed on commercial office space in the future? On the flip side, the offices that are provided may want to now have more space so that we can better socially distance and not all be breathing the same air at the same time. So I foresee that architects have a real opportunity throughout this recovery to really be thinking ahead about not how we go to the opposite end of the spectrum and button up and tighten everything up, but to really start to incorporate epidemics and health issues into the good work that they're already doing. And how do we make better decisions for the future based on what we now know are risks that could really pop up at any time?
Right. I mean, it seems to me density is going to be, which has long been one of the sort of easy mantras of all our disciplines, is suddenly taking a big hit.
Yes. Yeah. And I think to that end, quality of life. I mean, I can imagine how difficult it could be as a New Yorker living in a smaller space because real estate is expensive, and probably in a multi-story building. So going in and out to get groceries has a lot of risk associated with it. But not having a yard or other place to access as parks are closed is, I think, really tough.
Well, that's how the suburbs were born in the early 20th century, as a response to the basically the diseased nature of the industrial cities of the 19th century. That's how modernism came into being as a kind of a hygiene practice.
Yeah, that's right. And here we are again.
Here we are again at the beginning of the 21st century, looking at the same thing.
Here, we transition over to our conversation with Patrick MacLeamy, former CEO of HOK. Enjoy.
Okay, well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Patrick. Thanks for taking the time out to do this.
It's my pleasure.
You have, of course, a lot of experience in running a very significant firm, HOK, and you have just published this intriguing book published by Wiley, Designing a World-Class Architecture Firm, The People, Stories, and Strategies Behind HOK.
Yes.
But before we go down deep into HOK's history, I think one must begin by acknowledging these are very interesting times that we are living in with the coronavirus
Yes.
and all the social quarantining and the social challenges that are coming with that.
Yes.
But certainly, a question is the economic future of design firms and the kind of challenges that these kind of situations bring to firms. Now, I know you've written about this and you have some thoughts about this, but let me begin by asking: do you think that this is the current crisis that we are going through is one more economic recession, or do you think that this is a recession of a special time with respect to design firms?
Well, I think it's both, actually. I do think it's special in that none of us that's living today has lived through a pandemic.
Right.
So the idea that we're all sequestered and we're doing social distancing makes it very difficult for practitioners of architecture or anyone that's in almost any kind of business to carry on as usual. So what do you do? So that's the first thing, is it's a great challenge for all of us. I believe this will not last forever, nor does any other financial crisis, or recession, or other things, a major earthquake or big fire. These things all have a timeline.
The layoffs seem to be record numbers, and so that's going to have some serious long-term implications. Or at least what I'm hearing is there's a lot of fear. That this is going to produce a significant downturn in our industry. Do you believe that?
Yes, I think so. If we're in the grip of fear, it's hard to think straight about what to do to overcome the challenge.
Indeed.
So I prefer to think of it as, okay, there's some changed circumstance, but what can we do as architects? So let me first list the first thing that clients of architects do. Call my architect and say, please stop work.
Right.
Phase.
Right. So what's the strategy?
Well, the strategy is, first, if you're an owner, a partner or an owner in an architecture firm, you have to have a really good outreach to every single client so you understand exactly which clients will do what. You can certainly talk with your clients about extending a little bit to the end of a phase so you have a proper closing out of a phase, proper documentation.
Yeah, so it's good to sort of have a dialogue and even educate the client that while this may
Yes.
make
Yeah.
sense,
Then you
right?
have to say, all right, if I'm used to having income of $1,000 a month, and of the $1,000 a month, I spend $600 on payroll and $400 on everything else, then I have to say, all right, now instead of 1,000 a month, maybe I'm only going to get 500 or 700 or some other number. I have some choices as an owner. The most obvious one, which is the one I do not recommend, is, well, just call your staff and furlough them. Say, I'm sorry, we don't have enough work, and so you and you, you're out of a job. I'm very sorry. Go apply for unemployment. If you have a little money together and are able to do so, what I recommend is that you pull in everyone's belt, including and starting with yourself. Let's put everyone on, give everyone a 25% pay cut temporary.
32 hours, yeah.
So we'll continue to pay. You'll continue to get benefits, and we think we have enough money to get through 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of this. And what I promise to you as employees, because first you talk to your clients, then you talk to your employees all at once. You do it virtually if you can't do it in person, as we cannot today. And you say, please, let's share this together and we can overcome this together. Let's all take this pay cut. Let's everyone work from home. If you don't have your proper setup at home, let's help you get that. And there are ways to do that so that people have the ability to work online from their living room or their bedroom or their kitchen table. And let's continue to work for the projects that we have. And let's continue to take care of our clients. And let's stay in good touch with each other and with our clients. We are all family in this. Right. And then what I promise you is as the principal or the partner or the owner of the firm, that if we come out on the sunny side of this coronavirus and the restrictions about working from home are lifted and we can all go back to work, I promise you that we will all work together as hard as we can. And before I get my pay restored, I will make sure that each one of you gets that back pay, that 25% of your pay that you suffered with, that you get that restored, that we pay you back that piece out of the firm's profits for this year. And if we can't do it in this year, we'll continue to work on it in Q1 of next year. The reason I'm saying this is the easy way out is to say, okay, the game is up. I'm out of business. I'm going to lay off all my employees and I'm going to scratch around for my next architecture project once this is over. What you have now done with that is you've thrown away the best people that you know, the people that you have hired and trained, and people that, more importantly, know how to work together with you and with others in your firm. And that's that talent that you have assembled in your firm is precious. Do everything you can first before you let that talent slip away.
Right.
That's why I say that.
Yeah. Okay.
And then as this goes through, you cannot communicate too much or too many times with your employees. I think at least once a week there should be some kind of a firm-wide meeting, at least an email to everyone with an update. The client such and so, good news and bad news. The client such and so has agreed to extend us to the end of design development, but the other client has said, no, we want you to stop today. Tell them the truth, whatever you do. Right. Don't try to sugarcoat anything. If you really want to build the loyalty of your team, give them the honor of telling them the truth, even when it's difficult. Part of my advice for any firm is to set aside some piece of profits each month. Don't spend it. Build it up so that will allow you to cushion the month where the clients don't pay. Or if you have enough cash, maybe it will allow you to take advantage of having the money when a wonderful employee comes along that you need to invest in. You hire that person who's very good designer or an expert at healthcare or something else, and then you can afford to hire that person.
I mean, I think those are good, strategies for the firm. But let's stay with that Corona question a bit, and I share your optimism that this is one more downturn, and sooner or later we will come out of it. So it's stupid to throw away your intellectual capital with the times.
Yes.
But let's say longer than shorter period of working remotely and developing new ways of working. Do you see that practice in the way we practice, that there may be some changes that this might result in the way we put practice together, working more remotely or thinking?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I would say emphatically the answer is yes. Life is complicated enough for young people, especially who are working, who are juggling maybe a marriage, children, babysitting duties, two people in the same house working, some each sharing two jobs, and so on. So the ability to give someone the flexibility to work from home at least part of the time, it's just a good business practice, period. We did it for two reasons. I think the first one is to help, especially younger people, but actually anyone, juggle the pressure of a family and a job.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing that we found with a larger firm, people working in multiple offices, that we were able to work to create virtual teams of people. Whether you were working from home or in your office, it didn't matter. But if a person that was that expert in healthcare was in Dallas and the healthcare project was in Seattle, where you are, that person could be a member of the team to serve that Seattle healthcare client.
Right.
And so HOK began to develop virtual teaming as a business strategy. And it was a strategy to put the best people, the best team together for the client, so that no matter where the project was, we could basically guarantee the client that they were going to get our very best, most qualified people. The other thing we did, and I think this will also be true after the coronavirus, you've seen, all of us have seen the growth of these video conference setups like Zoom and GoToMeeting and so on. Well, we at HOK were putting large screen teleconferencing setups in large clients' offices, especially if they were in across the ocean or somewhere. And we said, look, instead of meeting you once a month by flying in an airplane, let's meet once a week virtually, and or once a day if we have to. But you can sit in your office, we can sit in ours. These are big screens. These are 5 by 7 feet screen. Right. And there are two of them. One is for faces and one is for the drawings and the 3D models and so on. And we can actually interact more with you as our client this way than we could if we all climbed on airplanes once a month and flew to across the ocean to Europe or to Asia. Right. And this became for HOK quite routine.
I think it's let's talk a little bit about HOK's culture, particularly historically speaking, and
yes,
and how that has changed over time. And you have noted over here that all of them, Helmut, Obata, and Kasbon, were colorful characters in their own rights.
Yes,
and
they were.
That one of them drew up the bomb rack on the Enola Gay. That especially caught my eye.
The firm was founded in St. Louis, Missouri, but the only one of the founders that was actually from St. Louis was George Helmuth. He was the son of an architect who practiced in St. Louis around the turn of the 1900s. And his father and his uncle had a firm called, of course, Helmuth and Helmuth that did mansions for well-off St. Louisans. They did They were both Catholics, so they did a lot of work for the Catholic Church, and they did commercial buildings in St. Louis. The most durable or famous of them, this is a little piece of history, is the International Fur Exchange building. Yes, by 1900, we were still trapping beavers and other animals, mostly in the West, and they were brought to St. Louis, originally by boat and later by rail. And the International Fur Exchange was where the furs were bought and sold. There was a big auction room, and there were offices for the members of the fur exchange. So it's just like a stock exchange.
Okay.
And that's probably their most notable work. But what young George Helmuth, the founder of HOK, learned as he was growing up is that his father and his uncle's firm was like he called it a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. They got a job, they hired some draftsmen, and they worked on the job, they trained the draftsmen, and each partner, each of the brothers designed and marketed for work. But neither one of them liked to sell, they liked to design. So they would hold off selling the next job until the first one was almost finished. Sometimes they got new work to fill in behind, and sometimes they did not. So all the effort and they made to hire and train draftsmen so that they finally had a good operation, that was all lost if they didn't have new work. They had to lay everybody off and then go out and find some more work. It was just down to the two brothers again, and then they would start over again with the next project. So young George Helmuth saw this when he was growing up, and it really seared him. It was a dramatic experience for him. So he decided that he was going to figure out how to make a firm that can survive a depression. He never worked for his father and uncle. They could never afford to hire him. And he eventually left St. Louis, moved to Detroit, and wrangled a job with Smith, Hinchman, and Grills. And Smith, Hinchman, and Grills were busy designing assembly plants for the automobile companies. So they had work. And George began as a designer, as I did, and then quickly joined their solicitation department because the partners at Smith, Hinchman, and Grills saw that he had a natural gift for selling. He wanted to be very scientific about it, so he wrote a 22-page paper about 3 or 4 things that you should do to make your firm recession or depression proof. Mm-hmm. The first one was, don't just focus on one building type. He said you have to learn how to design everything. And every design problem is an opportunity for a project and an opportunity to make your mark. Recessions and depressions are not uniform. Sometimes you'll have a slow period in Detroit, but boy, look at Chicago, it's just booming. Or maybe Seattle. So his other idea was you should continue to diversify geographically. So diversify. And architecture is a good profession, but there are other design specialties. And why don't we diversify into those as well? Why don't we learn how to do or hire some people that know how to do landscape architecture, planning, engineering for buildings, and then later programming and so on. Because there will always be something that a client needs. Be the jack of all trades. Helmuth, while he was at Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, realized that they didn't have a good designer at that firm and persuaded them to let him hire a young Japanese-American architect from Seattle, actually, named Minoru Yamasaki, who at that time was working in New York City. So he recruited Helmuth always called him Yama, to Detroit. And Yama began working with Helmuth on these projects and became a real celebrated designer for Smith Hinchman. And eventually they broke off, he and Yamasaki and one of the top production architects, Harold Lineweber, they broke off and formed their own firm in Detroit, Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Lineweber. Wow. That firm, almost within days of its founding, Helmuth went back to St. Louis, where he was from, and opened a branch office in St. Louis because he knew everybody in St. Louis. So he marketed both cities at the same time. They got very busy with the airport. With Helmuth won them the job to design new terminals for the St. Louis Lambert Airport. And Yama, of course, was the designer. It's a beautiful building that, instead of the railroad age where we had big, heavy, long buildings made of stone, Richardsonian type buildings, this was light and arched concrete that was filled with light. And Yama designed it, but he had so much work to do between the two cities of Detroit and St. Louis. He asked one of his friends from Cranbrook, who should I hire? I need a good young design assistant. And they said, well, you should hire young Gio Obata. And Gio Obata was also a Nisei like Yamasaki. He was born in the U.S. To immigrant Japanese parents. And Obata was working for SOM in Chicago. So he hired Obata in Detroit, but within 6 months had moved Obata to St. Louis to work full-time on the Lambert Airport project. And the St. Louis office needed a good top production architect. So they hired a Washington University professor whose name was George Kassebaum. And George Kassebaum had grown up in Kansas, loved architecture, but found in college at university that he especially loved the organizational work of putting together a building after the design had been put forth. And it was George Kassebaum that during the war spent his time working for the Boeing company and also at an Air Force base in Ohio. And he said he told me he's sure that he drew up the bomb rack for the Enola Gay, but the Air Force would never confirm it to him. It was a secret.
I see. Interesting.
Gio Obata was born in San Francisco and raised in Berkeley. His father was a very well-known artist. In fact, right now they have a virtual show because the Smithsonian has a collection of his paintings, but they've had to turn it into a virtual show instead of an in-person show. But Kura Obata was a well-known artisan from northern Japan who moved to California, settled, raised his family, and became a professor at University of California, Berkeley.
I see.
And Gio, their son, grew up. They always thought he would become an artist because his mother was also an artist. She was a specialist in ikebana, the art of arranging, Japanese art of flower arranging. So Obata decided, though, that he liked math and science. He was a practical kind of guy. And so he decided he wanted to be an architect and enrolled at UC Berkeley in September 1941 as a freshman. And in December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and World War II started. And the internment order came for all Japanese Americans that were living in Washington, Oregon, and California, that they had to go to the camps with one provision that if you were a full-time student, university student, you could continue your studies, but not in the 3 Western states.
Right.
So that caused Gio Obata to apply to other universities in the Midwest and the East, and the only school that accepted him was Washington University in St. Louis.
Right.
A small private university with a good reputation.
I see.
He came within 24 hours of being interned with his family. The telegram came from Washington University less than a day before they were supposed to take the train to their internment camp. So think about this: a young Japanese American boy just graduated from high school, on his way to someplace he'd never been during the war years when all the war feelings were strong. When he got to St. Louis, he found that the university, the faculty, and the other students just adopted him. And he fell in love with St. Louis and the university. He is the only one of the founders who's still living. And he's 96 and still lives in suburban St. Louis with
Really?
his fourth wife.
Wow, that's interesting. That's
So
interesting.
those are the three guys. And Helmuth, in addition to diversification, the other thing that Helmuth said in his strategy that was so important, I think, is that if you should have partners, and the partners should specialize instead of each partner as his father and uncle did. They both wanted to design buildings. They both wanted to market the next job. He said, no, you should specialize. Pick the partner that's best at design, and he or she will become better if they focus on that as their craft, as their specialty. And Helmuth wanted to be a full-time marketer. To our knowledge, he is the first principal or leader of a firm in the United States, at least, who became a full-time marketer when he and Yamasaki split, Helmuth, Yamasaki, and Leidenweber, and Helmuth took the St. Louis office and renamed it HOK and made Gio Obata and George Kassabaum his partners.
Right.
That occurred in 1955.
What you have a lot of history over there. You should write a complete history book on the firm, I'm sure. So, in concluding over here, as we are finishing up or rounding out our conversation here, let me say, I presume this is what you mean by running towards trouble rather than sort of running away from it.
Yes.
And is this also, how does this connect to your concept of positive peer pressure? I mean, how does positive peer pressure work? So let's conclude with that discussion about positive
Yes,
peer
okay.
pressure.
Well, running toward trouble is simply this. If there is a problem, maybe it's a client problem, maybe it's a personnel problem, or maybe it's a coronavirus problem, it does no good to avoid it somehow, thinking, well, maybe it will go away if I leave it alone. Problems don't work that way. The little problems become big ones, and big ones become catastrophic problems. So run toward trouble means square yourself up, take a hard look at the problem, do not be afraid, and find the right answers for you to go around or through the problem and get to the sunny side on the other side of it.
And positive peer pressure?
Yes, positive peer pressure basically says this. If you have a small firm or a large firm, people are all different. And if you have benchmarks for performance, how well you're doing financially, especially, it's very good if you can actually put, instead of keeping it a secret, we had open book. Everybody in the firm could see our numbers at the end of every month and see if the Dallas office was doing what they had promised they would do in their plan, or if the New York office was performing. And instead of having to go to these people myself and say, you're underperforming, you simply have a board meeting. We had a board meeting every month, virtual, with a video conference. We put everybody's numbers up in front of each other, and then we would ask those that were underperforming, what is your plan? What's the plan for you to run toward trouble and fix these problems and overcome them? And it wasn't so much my asking, it was their peers in the other offices saying, well, okay, Joe, what are you doing about this? And how can we help you? Maybe they don't have enough work. Well, maybe we can share some of our work. Maybe they need a talented person. Maybe they need to collect some money. Well, maybe we can help you with that. So peer pressure meant I want to be a member of the team. I don't want to let my team down. So it's a teamwork thing. Mm-hmm. So run toward trouble and teamwork are two things that I added to what the founders began the firm with. I added certainly those two.
Well, you had a long and very successful career at HOK, Patrick. I'm glad you wrote it all down in a book and shared that with our community. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for coming on Architecture Talk as well.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.